chart here called the four immeasurables, so let's go through that. So starting with loving kindness, here the definitions, it says a heartfelt yearning and vision for oneself and others to experience happiness and the causes of happiness. So again, the aspiration, wish for happiness and its causes. The proximate cause is what immediately precedes the cultivation of loving kindness, and the proximate cause here for loving kindness is seeing the lovable qualities of another person and oneself. It's on that basis then we can develop that aspiration of loving kindness. And we saw there that the next column, this near enemy, or sometimes called false facsimile, is something that looks like that thing, but actually is sort of opposite, and it's corrupting, it's polluting it. And so here, of course, we saw that that was attachment. And then there's what's called the far enemy or distant enemy. That's what's completely opposite to loving kindness. And that here is ill will, intention to harm or taking joy in another's misfortune. So the sign of success is, of course, to move away from what's opposite and towards the loving kindness. So the sign of success that our loving kindness practice is working is that we have less ill will and as well as an increase in friendliness and warm-heartedness. And then the remedy, remember the remedy was one of the other four measurables that helped us to overcome the near enemy. So to help us to overcome attachment, we can reflect on equanimity, which is of course free of attachment to friends and apathy to strangers and aversion to difficult people. And then compassion, of course the wish or aspiration for ourselves and others to be free of suffering and its causes. And here in that column it says the heartfelt yearning that all be free of suffering and its causes, asking what can I do? The proximate cause, what immediately precedes that is recognizing that others wish to be free of suffering and the helplessness of their suffering, and you're poised to do something or that something can be done. And here we saw again that the near enemy of compassion was this despair, and here it also mentions this idea of depression, depression. And of course what is directly opposite to compassion is contempt and cruelty, taking pleasure in someone else's suffering. So again, the sign of success that our compassion practice is working is that is decreasing, that capacity for cruelty and delight in others' misfortunes subsides, gets less and less and less. And then of course, if we're falling into that near enemy, into that sort of state of despair, again, it's often because we're focusing too much on the negative. So the remedy for that is this empathetic joy, to focus on the positives of ourselves and others. And then empathetic joy is, again, that rejoicing in our own and others' virtues and so forth. And so we see here that in the definition, delight in other people's virtues, successes and joys. And the proximate cause, what immediately precedes that, is simply attending to then the virtues, successes and joys of oneself and others. And that will lead to then the delight in that. And again, here we saw that the near enemy of empathetic joy of rejoicing is this frivolous or meaningless rejoicing. And it really is just simply attachment to pleasure. And what is directly opposite to empathetic joy, or rejoicing, of course, is envy and cynicism, to be a cynic, and also envy, of course, very similar to the idea of jealousy. So when others have something good happen, we, instead of be happy for them, we're jealous of them. And of course, the sign of success in empathetic joy is a reduction in that, is the reduction in this envy, jealousy or cynicism. And of course, to overcome the near enemy, that is to this frivolous joy, meaningless joy, or this really just attachment to pleasure, of course, loving kindness, to really reflect on our own and others' happiness and its causes. And then lastly, equanimity, or this impartial and biased attitude here. is defined here as even-heartedness, even-mindedness and impartiality, attending without attachment or aversion. The proximate cause, what immediately precedes that, is taking responsibility for one's own conduct and actions, meaning to not blame other people for our situation or to see other people as a source of happiness, and thereby we can let go of course, that attachment and aversion and so forth, and then have this instead this mind of equanimity. The near enemy, of course, what seems like equanimity, but is actually polluting it, is this sort of indifference, being equally indifferent to everyone. What is exactly completely opposite to equanimity, of course, is the attachment to those close to us and aversion to those who are difficult. And then, of course, the sign of success in equanimity, of course, is reducing that, reducing our craving and attachment and aversion, anger, hostility, and so forth. And then, of course, if we see that equanimity is simply degenerating into simply being indifferent, then to reflect on compassion, because by seeing others suffering, it becomes difficult to remain indifferent. So these are the four immeasurables that are the foundation of the compassion wing of practice. What I'd like to do in this session now is sort of take it one step further. So these four immeasurables are really the foundation of the compassion wing of practice in all Buddhist traditions. In the Mahayana Buddhist traditions, we build on those four immeasurables with what's called bodhicitta. Bodhicitta is a Sanskrit word. We can divide into two. Bodhi is Sanskrit for enlightenment. And citta is Sanskrit for mind. So bodhicitta is literally the mind of enlightenment. And it's the aspiration for enlightenment for the sake of others. Because now, when we're cultivating these four immeasurables, wishing ourselves and others to have happiness in its causes, wishing ourselves and others to be free of suffering in its causes, then we can understand that everyone like ourselves is stuck in this situation. And that not only then striving for ourselves to be liberated from all suffering in its causes, but then cultivating the wish to help to liberate everyone else from suffering. But of course, if we cultivate that wish, then we can realise, well, in my current situation, I can't really be of much use to anyone because I have my own suffering and mental affliction, so I'm not very capable of helping others. So how could I be most capable of helping others? And that is if I were to, of course, eliminate all my mental afflictions and suffering and fully develop all my positive qualities. If I really achieve full awakening, this enlightenment, then I can really be most effective in helping others. And so that is bodhicitta. So this bodhicitta is taking this loving kindness and compassion and so forth to the sort of the next level. And traditionally there are two main ways that were historically taught on how to cultivate that. And we'll look at both of those. The first one sort of fairly briefly. The first approach to really cultivating this aspiration, the first approach is called the 7 cause and effect method. So there's 7 steps here. And this is the one that was most widely taught historically. The second technique, which we're going to look at in more detail shortly, was sort of considered to be a little bit too difficult for the average person to cultivate. So it was not really taught so widely. But I think in our modern world, the second technique can be often much more powerful, and I'll explain why shortly. And the first technique, or first approach, could be a little bit problematic. And for 2 reasons, and both of those reasons are to do with the first point. So let's have a look at the first point and see how it may be problematic for us in the modern world. And the first step is to see everyone as our mother. And the reasoning behind this is that in this life we have a mother, in the previous life we had a mother, and if we keep going back, through that line of reasoning we can appreciate that everyone has been our mother at one point or another. But of course that reasoning falls down if we have no belief in rebirth. So that's one difficulty. And also, of course, the purpose of doing this is that, at least historically, the mother has been generally the person who's benefited us most in our life, carried us in the womb and gave birth to us and looked after us as a baby and fed us and clothed us and maybe even helped to educate us and so forth. So the idea being that through this line of reasoning, to come to see how everyone has been of great benefit to us. But of course, unfortunately, some people in the modern world have some issues with their mother. And so if we start seeing everyone as our mother, we might start hating everyone. So then the text sometimes says, well, okay, you can replace that with father or brother, sister or teacher or whatever. Whoever's benefited us most in our life. Because we've had that relationship with everyone based on that reasoning. But again, if we have no belief in rebirth, then that may be difficult to do, the first step. But anyway, we'll go through the 7 steps anyway to have a look at the process. And so then by seeing everyone as our mother, the second point is to reflect on their kindness. Is to really reflect on how kind all mother sentient beings have been to us. And through reflecting on their kindness, that would lead to the third step of having a wish to repay that kindness. And then through cultivating this wish to repay their kindness, that would lead to the 4th and 5th step. which is great loving kindness and great compassion. So of course here we see the word great. And great, when we see great loving kindness, great compassion, so remember loving kindness and compassion. Loving kindness is a wish or aspiration for ourselves and others to be free, to have happiness in its causes. Compassion is the wish or aspiration for ourselves and others to be free of suffering in its causes. The word great is, we're taking that to the next level. Not only wishing ourselves and others to have happiness and be free of suffering, but doing whatever we can to place mother sentient beings in freedom from suffering and in happiness. So this is much more active, proactive. It's doing whatever we can. And then on that basis, we can take it to even another level, which is step 6. Which is altruistic intention. And step 6 is then taking the great loving kindness, great compassion to the next level in terms of making it our personal responsibility to liberate all mother sentient beings from suffering and place them in happiness. I myself alone am going to do that. I'm going to make it my personal responsibility. But of course, if we have that altruistic intention, then we can realise, well, in my current state, I can't really do much to help mother sentient beings. So how can I really begin to actualise this? Is if I achieve full awakening, eliminate all my mental afflictions and suffering, and fully develop my positive qualities, then I can really start to do that. And so, of course, that is the aspiration of bodhicitta. So this is the 7 cause and effect method, the process we go through to really cultivate this aspiration of bodhicitta. And this bodhicitta is really the door of entry and the support for everything we do in what's called the Mahayana Buddhist traditions. That if we want to enter into the path to enlightenment, we cultivate this aspiration to strive for enlightenment for the benefit of others. And then that is what is motivating us in everything we do in our life. So that is the first method for cultivating this bodhicitta. Any questions about that before we spend more time on the second method?
Not specifically, so maybe we'll talk about this later, about the Theravada, what they are doing. If in the Mahayana we want to get to enlightenment from bodhicitta.
Yeah. So the basis of all Buddhist traditions in the compassion wing are these 4 immeasurables. So when we engage in that in the Theravada, that's the practices we do. Often they're called something different. They're called the 4 Brahma Viharas in Theravada tradition, but it's the cultivating these 4 qualities. Particularly often the first one is emphasised a lot, and in Pali, of course, it's metta bhavana, the cultivation of metta, of loving kindness. But of course, all of those 4 qualities are the core of this aspect of practice in the Theravada Buddhist traditions. And in the Mahayana, of course, that's the basis. And on that basis, we sort of take it to the next level of bodhicitta.
So in the Theravada, they want to reach enlightenment, themselves, nirvana, or and they cultivate this 4 immeasurables.
Yeah, because, yeah, exactly. Because at the foundation level, we realise that, of course, we're all in the same situation. We're all wanting to be happy, wanting to be free of suffering. And in that sense, we can cultivate equanimity. And in that sense, we can then have this loving kindness and compassion for ourselves and others because we're all in the same situation. And of course, also the empathetic joy as well. But generally, and this is a bit philosophical now, and maybe we'll touch on it maybe in the second half if we get a bit of time, but in the Theravada, there's not really this idea of achieving enlightenment and then continually helping everyone, because within the Theravada traditions, when we achieve liberation from suffering, we achieve this, what's called nirvana, then end of story, finish. And so then this idea of bodhicitta doesn't really make sense, because, you know, maybe we achieve nirvana now, we've got 10 years or 20 years or 30 years left in this life, but then at the end of this life, that's it, finished. So how can we hope to help liberate everyone from suffering in that short time? It wouldn't make sense. Whereas, of course, philosophically, the Mahayana has a different idea that, yes, we can achieve liberation, achieve enlightenment, but then that's not like end of story. That's the beginning of the story. And so then it makes sense. So it's a bit of a philosophical underpinning why we would not, or yes, try to cultivate this aspiration.
I do understand why gaining bodhicitta is the way for me to liberate all my previous mothers from suffering. I mean, what is in being in enlightenment that gives me the power to actually perform my altruistic intention and so forth?
Because you have now no mental afflictions, you have no suffering, and you've fully developed all your positive qualities. Does that mean you can walk around, wave a magic wand and dispel people's suffering? Of course not. Of course not. I mean, if that was the case, we'd all be liberated, because the Buddha would have done that.
Yeah.
Wave his magic wand. But what it means is that now we have the maximum capacity to help others. How do we help others? We teach them, we show them the way. I mean, that's all we can do. And we can lead by example. They can see, you know, they get inspired by us.
And, okay, because what you said about the Theravada, that once you attain enlightenment, then that's it. So how is it different in the Mahayana?
Again, that's a whole story, a whole big thing, but and again, we'll maybe touch on it if we have time in the second half of the retreat. But it all has to do really with this sort of continuity of mind, and that from the Mahayana perspective, that sort of continues, of course, and then we still appear in the world, but of course we no longer have suffering. So the Mahayana assertion would say that somehow it can't terminate. The mind, when we achieve nirvana, it's not like it's terminated. There's a continuity there, and therefore we can still come and appear in the world again and again and again forever to help others. But we're not, of course, suffering. That's the assertion. So that's the difference. And if we get a little bit of time in the second half, we'll touch on that.
Something bothered me about equanimity. Well, it's reasonable to have loving kindness and compassion for everybody. But equanimity, well, it always will be a difference between everybody and my children, or everybody and something.
Right. But remember, equanimity is not behaviour, and it's not meaning we have to spend equal time with everyone. That's not equanimity. Equanimity is simply being free of attachment, indifference and aversion. If we have that attitude, then of course we're going to spend more time with our children because we have some responsibilities there and behave in a certain way with them because of those responsibilities. And then of course we'll spend different amount of time with friends and different behaviour because of the relationship and so forth. So we're just talking about the underlying attitude, not that equal amount of time, equal behaviour in terms of the same behaviour. That's not equanimity. Equanimity is simply having a state of mind that's free of attachment, indifference and aversion. That's all. Okay. Let's now have a look at the second approach, which I think can be quite powerful for us in the modern world. And also, in the second approach, there's no assumption of a belief in rebirth in that approach. So the second approach has 5 steps, and it's called equalizing and exchanging self with others. The first step is equalizing self with others. And the way to, and because now we tend to feel like my happiness is more important than the happiness of anyone else. We put ourselves above others. And so equalizing here is understanding that we're at the same level in that sense. And we can use the same sort of line of reasoning as is with equanimity, understanding that we all equally want to be happy and to be free of suffering. We're all equal in that regard. And so in that sense, to understand we're all on the same level with respect to wanting to be happy, wanting to be free of suffering. That our happiness is no more important than the happiness of anyone else. So that's the first step. The second step is to reflect on the disadvantages of self-cherishing. Self-cherishing is not about feeling good about ourselves. Of course, we need to feel good about ourselves. Self-cherishing is another name for the selfish, self-centered attitude that sees my happiness as more important than the happiness of anyone else. Superficially, it may seem like this self-cherishing mind is our friend bringing us happiness. That, me first attitude. If I don't look after me first, then I'm not going to be happy. And unfortunately, in the modern society, that attitude seems to be promoted. Me first. Where have we heard that before? America first? Someone said that. But of course, if we look closely, this me first attitude is our worst enemy. It only brings suffering. So let's have a look at some results of this me first attitude. I'm more important. Generally, if we have this selfish state of mind, then often we can become very obsessed about me and my happiness and me and my suffering. And generally, if we become obsessed about me and my suffering, generally together with that is the idea that the source of my suffering is out there. And so what often happens is then we develop a lot of fear and anxiety about the world. Because everything out there is a potential threat. So I better be on guard. So actually it becomes very stressful. And this was highlighted recently. I saw they did a medical study. It was a very extensive medical study